I want to take you back to June 2022. The Supreme Court had just overturned Roe versus Wade, striking down the constitutional right to an abortion in this country. The decision immediately left millions of Americans without access to reproductive rights or reproductive care. And in states where that care was protected, millions more wondered if it was just a matter of time until a federal ban would go into effect. Some Republicans, fearing an electoral disaster in the coming months, were quick to throw cold water on that theory, claiming the court's decision would simply send the issue back to the states. Effectively, these GOP lawmakers said a national ban on abortion, that would never happen. Here's Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina just last month.
I've been consistent. I think states should decide the issue of marriage and states should decide the issue of abortion. I have respect for South Carolina. South Carolina voters here, I trust, to define marriage and to deal with the issue of abortion.
Well, that respect for the state of South Carolina appears to be short-lived. Here's Lindsey Graham on Tuesday unveiling a new bill.
I think we should have a law at the federal level that would say after 15 weeks, no abortion on demand.
Now, blatant hypocrisy aside here, even other Republicans realize that Lindsey Graham's proposal isn't good politics. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's facing an uphill battle to gain control of the chamber in November, told reporters, quote, "Most of the members of my conference prefer that this be dealt with at the state level." This isn't a shock, because public opinion is not on Graham's side, especially in battleground states like Pennsylvania. That's where Republican Senate candidate Mehmet Oz is being blasted by his Democratic opponent, John Fetterman, for refusing to say whether he'd vote yes on Graham's bill. Fetterman has even dedicated an entire section of his website to what he calls Ozwatch, where he counts the days, minutes, and seconds it's taking Oz to come clean about his stance on the proposal. Mitch McConnell is a master politician. He knows not to endorse a federal abortion ban just weeks before the midterm. But it's telling that many other Republicans are willing to make that endorsement, including Georgia GOP Senate candidate Herschel Walker. And in the House, Republicans just introduced even more legislation to restrict abortion nationwide, bringing forward a bill that would undo Biden administration guidance and allow pharmacists the power to refuse to provide abortion-inducing drugs. The states' rights line of defense we heard so much about, well, it was a lie. It was nothing but a lie. And those who claim otherwise are most likely doing so just to save their electoral prospects come November. As Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal put it, overturning Roe was never about giving power back to the states. It was about controlling our bodies and our personal autonomy. Let's bring in Georgia Democratic State Senator Jen Jordan. She's the Democratic nominee for Attorney General of Georgia, and Monica Simpson, Executive Director of Sister Song, a reproductive justice collective. She was part of a group of activists who met with Vice President Kamala Harris at the White House earlier this week. Thank you so much for joining us. State Senator Jen, Jordan, I'd like to start with you. Excuse me. Let's be clear about what I at least think what Graham's proposed federal law would do. Right now, your home state of Georgia has a 6-week ban on abortion, which would be allowed to stay in place, but in less restrictive states, abortion access would be absolutely curtailed. What kind of legal battles could arise if Graham's bill actually became law?
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be clarification, because I've even heard pundits talk about Graham's bill as if it just creates a 15-week ban, right? So some people in Georgia were saying, well, that's good for us, right? But what they don't understand is that 15 weeks across the board, unless the state has a more restrictive law, and that's the one that goes in place. I mean, let's be clear in terms of Lindsey Graham and Republicans, period. They want states to control the decisions about abortion if they control the states, right? And so, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen, but I think that Lindsey Graham really let the cat out of the bag in terms of what the real intention here is with Republicans nationwide after Dobbs.
Monica, some Republicans have described a 15-week ban as a moderate alternative to other restrictions, as we just heard there. But this means that patients seeking abortion care after 15 weeks will no longer be able to go to another state for the procedure. They'll have to travel basically to another country. Talk about the impact this proposal could have, especially among those who can't afford to make that trip.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will say that I want to make it very clear that what we saw this week was an attempt to move a national abortion ban. I think that sometimes when we hear 15 weeks versus however many other weeks, like people try to put in front of that ban, what we saw here was the move for a national ban. And this will absolutely have incredible impact on communities of color, on low-income folks, and it will make it nearly impossible for people to be able to make safe decisions for themselves and to be able to determine how they want to live their lives.
State Senator Jordan Graham claims that his bill has exceptions for the life of a mother, rape and incest, but as the 19th notes, these exceptions, they actually require people to jump through significant logistical, legal, and bureaucratic hoops that render them nearly impossible to utilize. Can you talk to us about some of these?
Yeah, I mean, and look, and I want to go back here because what we're talking about, and Monica is exactly right. I mean, this is a ban nationwide. So when we talk about states that have really been much more supportive with respect to women's rights, let's talk about New York, let's talk about Illinois or California. Those are the states that are going to get impacted by Lindsey Graham's bills, not the Georgias, because the Georgia, 6-week ban is going to stay into effect. And so what's going to happen is the states where people actually can access abortion care and where women's rights are intact, that's what Lindsey Graham's bill really seeks to destroy. And that's why the national ban is so incredibly dangerous.
Monica, I mentioned that you met with Vice President Kamala Harris at the White House earlier this week. Based on what you discussed during that meeting, is the White House, in your opinion, in your mind, ready to meet this moment? What steps would you like to see from the federal government to protect abortion access nationwide?
I will say that we are ready, and it was an incredible meeting that we had at the White House, and it seems as if the Biden administration has made incredible moves. Not even seems, they have made incredible moves towards being in alignment with where we know we need to be to ensure that people in this country are able to make their own decisions about their reproductive lives. And what we are going to continue to do is to continue to ask this Biden administration to put the pressure where the pressure needs to be, to put the safeguards where the safeguards need to be, and continue to move the resources in the places that we need them so that people can get what they need, and to really address and continue to push in all the ways possible to make sure that people are not criminalized for making a healthcare decision in this country. That's what we're going to continue to push. We have a strong collective force of advocates across different sectors, across different movements who are ready to move and ready to act in this moment.
State Senator, I want to ask you about this uncharted legal territory that we're in. After Roe fell, a 2019 fetal personhood law took effect in your state, meaning basically that a fetus now has the same constitutional rights as a person. And if I recall at the time, you argued against the law and suggested that Georgia would be required to pay public benefits to the fetus of an immigrant woman, even as it now denies those benefits to her because any person born in the U.S. becomes a citizen automatically. Tell us about this uncharted legal territory that we're finding ourselves in.
Yeah, here in Georgia, basically an embryo is a person under Georgia law. And so if you think about all the rights that are attendant with being a person under the law, I mean, all of it, whether you're talking about social welfare benefits, whether you're talking about due process, riding in the HOV lane. I mean, I know that's been kind of batted around in the press, but that is really what's at issue here. And we already have the Department of Revenue issuing guidelines in terms of deductions, tax deductions that women can take when they become pregnant, even if then they miscarriage or if they have multiple miscarriages. So it's one of these things that this is really opened a Pandora's box in this state. And look, Lindsey Graham's national ban is just the beginning. I mean, we saw with Congressman Buddy Carter from Georgia, where he is filing a bill that basically is going to let pharmacists refuse to fill prescriptions for birth control, for contraception. That's where we are, and that's where they're headed. And so voters, women, everybody in this country needs to be vigilant and needs to understand exactly where they're going with it.
Monica, I want to ask you about just how we talk about this in this country for a moment. And it's switching gears here a bit, because at that meeting with the White House, you touched on the role pop culture can play in the discussion around reproductive rights. And this week you had Chrissy Teigen sharing that the miscarriage that she had back in 2020 was actually a life-saving abortion, something that she didn't even realize herself until the fall of Roe. She said, quote, "I fell silent, feeling weird that I hadn't made sense of it that way. I told the world we had a miscarriage. The world agreed we had a miscarriage. All the headlines said it was a miscarriage. And I became really frustrated that I didn't in the first place say what it was. And I felt silly that it had taken me over a year to actually understand that we had had an abortion." Has the Dobbs decision helped normalize these kinds of candid discussions around abortion? And is that what we need to have in this country?
We absolutely need, and I do believe that this decision has brought the topic of abortion to the front, right? It is not something that we are able to push to the side anymore. If you are looking to do anything in terms of policy in this country, you have to address abortion. We need not only reproductive justice voters, we also need reproductive justice candidates, those folks who are willing to stand strong on these issues. And so because of the Dobbs decision, we are seeing so many more of these stories coming to the forefront, and we need more of that. And I do think the power of culture, the power of storytelling is something that is absolutely needed. People need to see themselves reflected. They need to understand that their stories are not theirs alone, that they share stories with so many other people. So I absolutely believe that's something we have to invest in and continue to uplift.
Yeah, you can't emphasize that enough. You are not alone. That is the importance of sharing these stories. Georgia Democratic State Senator Jen Jordan and Monica Simpson, thank you so much for joining us this hour. I greatly appreciate your time.